Everybody, thanks for joining us. The recording is now in progress. So thanks for joining us today. As you know, that we'll be going over today the reporting and reimbursement requirements for the value-added producer grant. This workshop is provided by the Center for Cooperative and Enterprise Development, as well as Matson Consulting. I'm Jessica Shaw with Matson Consulting, and I'm joined by Jim Matson, also with Matson Consulting, and Steve Richards, who some of you may know. He's also the executive director for the center. Also with us today is V. Gartman with USDA Rural Development. You all should be familiar with her. She's the one who's going to be handling your reimbursements, and she's also here to just answer any additional questions that you guys may have as we go through the presentation. I also want to mention that this webinar is made possible by funding through the USDA's Rural Cooperative Development Grant. So just a quick overview of what we're going to go over today. Jim is going to take us through some of the allowable and unallowable expenses, as well as looking at your work plan and budget and relating that back to your reimbursement paperwork. Then I'll go through some of the strategies for reimbursement, as well as the specific paperwork that you'll need to provide for your reimbursements. Then I'll also talk about reporting, mostly your biannual report that you'll need to do, and then finally cover if you might need to do some budget modifications. Then we'll open it up for questions. If you have questions in the meantime, just place them in the chat box or hold on to them until we open up the floor. But I just ask for everybody to kind of remain on mute so we can get through the presentation and then go from there. So we'll dive into it, and I will hand it over to Jim to talk to you guys about expenses.
Cool. Good morning, y'all. Thanks for diving in with us on this. I appreciate it. And I guess when the first thing we're trying to hit, we're talking about the reimbursement and getting your money back, because the easier you can make it for V, the quicker you'll get your money back, and the happier to make you two in the process. So I guess the first thing is to make sure that you keep out of your grant. I mean, we always recommend that you download a hard copy of your grant, and go ahead and print out a paper copy of it to save somewhere, just in case your computer commits suicide in the middle of the year, you get hit by a lightning storm. But it's always good to have a paper copy. But in particular for getting reimbursed, the part that really matters coming out of it is the work plan and the budget. And we pulled up kind of the budget example out of that. But here are kind of the key items that you set up that you're trying to figure out how to shoehorn things into the strange government categories of the personnel, travel, supplies, contractual, and other that you set up on your grant when you did your proposal. And then you have your details and your work plan that sort of describe what these numbers mean. So I guess what it says, when you're going for reimbursement, you want to keep, you can't do a bait and switch. You kind of gotta stick with what you had said you were gonna do in your original budget. That's how you got funded, was based on that. So you kind of gotta, so if you're saying on personnel and things, you can't all of a sudden switch from doing field crops to suddenly wanting to do alpaca. You gotta stick to the area that you had in your budget. What's going on? We'll talk a little bit about some exceptions and changes later, but for the core of it, you want to be sticking to kind of what you said and where those categories are over time. I'll put a few comments on our side. The detail of exactly when you were spending it isn't quite as important on the reimbursement as it was on the proposal side. So if something you were thinking might be in year one shifts a little bit to year two for reason, that's okay. But you want to be sure that you're sticking to those same categories that you had when you're working on it. And obviously, when you turn it in, depending upon which grant you have, right here we have one that's the 50-50 match with it. You want to turn it in so you're matching your total cost on reimbursement with what you have. So if you were doing if you had the 90% federal, instead of being there, it's going to be there. And Jessica's going to show some forms later that has exact detail on this. So I don't want to go too much down that, but I just want to hit that you want to be sure to follow these categories on the work plan and what you said you were going to do. Kind of stick with those core items. I mean, obviously, if you said you were going to buy, one type of glassware and you switch it to a different type, that could change, or a different type of boxes within there. I think, you know, there's a little bit of stuff you don't have to go and check with on, you know, exact quantity if you were going to buy, you know, but really trying to stick with those key items you're having in your work plan and documenting as it goes along will make your life a lot easier, and, you know, V's life. And so, you know, I would pin this up somewhere in a notebook so you have your budget, so you know how much you have in each of those categories over time, because those are the ones you want to track to back for reimbursement. And then, you know, what can you cover, or what can you not pay for within the grant? And I'm going to hit this real fast on things, but again, you can't pay for trucks, you can't pay for tractors, you can't pay for any major, you know, repairs and major maintenance for vehicles on those. So, you know, engine repair, tires, etc. You know, it's just got to be things that are considered operational within there, and so they can't do that. And some of that isn't on, you know, to take the pressure off some of that isn't on her. Some of that comes back in grant laws as a whole, that if USDA allowed you to buy those things, they actually would have to come and do an ownership of that under the grant and track it for the entire useful life of those vehicles. So that's part of why vehicles aren't covered, because there's one V, and there's already, you know, all of y'all from this year, as well from the people of previous years, whatnot. So she's trying to track down, you know, on this program itself, like 100 people at one particular time. So it's just sort of impossible to manage that. But again, no trucks, no tractors, no trailers, none, you know, and obviously under this one, the other things that you can't cover within there under your expenses are, you know, it all has to be on the, you know, it's a value added grant. So you can't do anything on the production side. And what the typical rule with that is, if it happens as it's coming, you know, out of the field, it's production side. If you've stored it and then started the value added stuff, then that's allowable. So, you know, nothing that happens on the farm side can happen. No equipment, and the federal government definition of equipment is it costs more than $5,000 per unit and lasts more than a year. So, you know, if it's so there are some small pieces of stuff that we could consider equipment. If you had it in your grant to begin with, then you might be able to cover. If it was less than $5,000, technically that's a supply under federal rules. But again, it would have to be something that you probably had in your grant budget already to be covered like that. Also, you know, no seeds, no harvest labor. And again, on a lot of farms, you know, you're using the same people for harvest that you're using for value added. So if you have a case like that, what you need to do is do something logical, and either be tracking it on an hourly basis on their timesheets. So you can say they spent, you know, this many hours on activities on it, or if it's something they do habitually, you can also turn in saying they spend a third of their time on value added when they get their paycheck. But you need to have some logic behind that you can turn in and say, here's how I'm tracking to make sure that my person who's also doing planting and harvest, because that happens pretty often. But you have to have a way that you can track it that's logical and makes sense that's going along with that. So, and you can do that, like I said, you can do it by tracking it on their hours and what's happening on a daily or weekly basis, because it may change. You know, you may have somebody that works in the field full time at planting time, but then in the summer they're doing deliveries for you and not working the field. So some of that could switch over time, but you need a logical thing and be able to explain that and back that up when you're doing it. And also, you know, you can't pay for animal feed, you can't pay for supplies. Again, on the animal side, it has to be, you know, kind of anything from the time after you put the knife to the neck of the critter counts. You know, on crops, it's basically once you've got them, you know, out of the field and into the cooler, and then you're starting to package them for cold storage, sell, take to the farmers markets. From then on, you can count within there. And again, you know, you should already have these listed in your work plan. If they were kind of improved in your work plan, they should be, you know, basically, you know, in most cases, they're going to be legal. Occasionally, something sneaks through a work plan for the reviewers that wasn't eligible. So V may have to come back and say, hey, that, you know, you can't pay for that, you know. An example of some other things you can't pay for, you can't pay for like promotional materials, like T-shirts to sell or magnets or other things that have your farm name on it. Those just aren't allowable under this grant with that. You can't pay yourself or any sort of direct family member that's living under your roof. If it's a third cousin twice removed, that gets out there far enough. But anybody that's kind of under your own roof in your control, you can't pay for with that. And I would say if you're doing adult children, it's probably better to just not go down that route as well. That's kind of one of those slight gray areas, but it's probably better typically to not cover that labor. Again, you can do a pass through and pay your own business. So if you own more than one business, you can't pay yourself on the other side of the coin to do stuff with it. I already hit the promotional products, but glassware, barware, a lot of times for vineyards is one that comes up here, but t-shirts, other things. And again, you have to have things that you already had back in those work plan categories. You can't come up with a brand new expense category that you talked about if you suddenly decided that you need to pay for, a whole area you weren't talking about. So, and the other thing that also counts for match. You can't spend that money, on promotional products and count that as match either. If it doesn't count as an allowable expense to be paid back for the federal government, you can't count it as your match as well. The exception is, of course, family labor. If you included labor for that 25% as match, you obviously, you can include that. So if you're putting family labor in as match, that is allowable at the rate that you kind of set up in your grant budget within there. So what do you end up covering there? We've done the thou shalts, thou shall not. But let's talk a few things about some of the things you can cover. Anything, again, this is value added. So anything that's there, any marketing expenses, if you're processing, chopping it, bagging it, freezing it, all those things, any of the supplies needed to have that done, any of the transportation needed to take it to market, to take it to your clients, transportation, if you have to collect from people as well, from these value added things, and you have to go pick up checks and all that. Credit card fees, processing stuff, any of those are allowable expenses. Mask, gloves, sanitizers, any PPP stuff, even if you did, and this is one exception, even if you didn't have this in your budget originally, and you realize that you need PPP or safety equipment, that is an allowable change in your budget. So if you're doing that, you want to mark what that is, but that is something that's I think the federal government's allowing. So if you realize you're going to need, more gloves, more masks, sanitizer for farmers markets, that sort of thing, that is allowable under your grant. That's one area where you can tweak your budget without having to ask for a budget admin. Also, again, non-family labor and non-production labor, you can go ahead and do that. You can pay, payroll taxes. So it's the loaded part of labor. You can pay all of it. They're federal taxes, they're indirect, they're workman's comp, all those, you can cover all that. So for anybody, workers that you have hired with there, and again, anything that's in case we haven't covered it, any of those, related expenses, if you're paying somebody to process it for you, if you're hiring an accountant to help to cover your books on this stuff, if you're working with a marketing agency for your value added stuff, all those are eligible expenses, within your, and hopefully those were already in your grant. You were talking about it, but we can flip back to some other things on there.
Thank you, Jim. So I'll go through some of the strategies, tips for doing reimbursement, and then we'll talk about the specific paperwork that you'll need to fill out when you're doing that. So we always suggest that for your first reimbursement to start soon and start small. That means go ahead and try to get in at least one reimbursement for the past month. That is, even if it's $1,000, it just helps you get started to fill out some paperwork, making sure that you're doing it correctly. It gives you a chance to get feedback from V if there's something that you need to change or do differently on your reimbursement. And it also gives you a sense of the turnaround time for when you can expect to receive that reimbursement, because you definitely want to plan for that. It's not something to where you send in the paperwork and the next day you're getting the money back. There has to be time for V to review it and to approve it and for it to go through. And then you want to try to determine a submission pattern. You can't do it more than once monthly, but so if every 2 months works for you or something like that, just try to figure out again what works for your cash flow and for your submission process. And
I would also say by getting started soon, you can double check that the bank information is correct, that you didn't write down the wrong number on your bank account, you know, do a small one, because when these are set up, effectively what it is you have, you know, effectively a bank account set up somewhere in Kansas City that the federal government has done that, you know, has your funds in it. And V, when she's getting these reimbursement requests, is allowing that money to be released into your account. So it's good to check on that ahead of time. Also, by going ahead and turning something in, it shows that you have your grant active. It shows that you're actively engaged in doing your grant. And so that's one thing to check on the federal side, to say, are you using it? Are you actually working on this? And by turning in a reimbursement, that's one of the best ways to check to show that you've done that.
Also, just remember that your plans and business change. So have a backup plan in case something does get rejected. If you put an expense there, again, you should be referring back to your work plan and budget for what you're submitting a request for. But just keep that in mind, that if it's something in the gray area, it may not be accepted. And we'll go into more about doing budget modifications at the end too.
Yeah, and also think about it before that happens, that if something is rejected, you haven't lost that money. You have the same amount of money in your grant. It just means you're going to have to spend it on something else other than what you were thinking of. So except for the date when you're at the very last day for closeout of the grant, you still have access to those funds. So I know it gets frustrating if you turn something in and it comes back to say, well, you can't spend money on that. We all, you know, the first thing we want to do is bang our head against the wall and, you know, throw a temper tantrum. I certainly do, but, you know, but work on it. But also remember, you haven't lost that funding. So it's not like it's gone away. So once you take 10 seconds and count to 15, you know, and look at it, remember that you still have those funds. You could submit it for another item.
Also, keep in mind that you'll need to keep your SAM updated throughout the grant process. You're going to have to renew that every single year, and you want to keep it active, because if it becomes expired, then that causes an issue with you getting your reimbursements. So definitely make sure you renew it before it expires. You'll get some emails and stuff from SAM. Make sure when you do get those emails that they are coming directly from sam.gov. You will get emails from other sites that are saying, hey, your SAM's expired. And you're thinking, no, that's not for another 6 months. Probably isn't true. So you can check your registration and your actual your SAM expiration date at sam.gov. Make sure you are using sam.gov and not any other site. There may be sites that are saying that they will help you renew it, that you know, they'll go through that process for you. The process should be completely free. No payment is required. And because if you end up using one of those sites, you could run into a number of issues with them holding your account hostage. I know that sounds dramatic, but that's true, to where you're not able to log into it anymore and you have to continually go through them. They could delay submitting your renewal, which could cause it to expire, which again could cause issues with you getting your funds. So just anything that you do that is related to SAM, make sure it is sam.gov. That's who's sending you the email, and that's the website that you're going to.
Yeah, and we recommend don't clicking through, even if you think it's from the federal site. Just go ahead and log on directly to sam.gov yourself and pull up your site directly, but don't do a click through on any emails or any other things, because some of those sites are, even with me telling it, I've been fooled once or twice on those sites, because they design themselves to look like they're the federal government. And then, you know, all the way at the bottom of a 4-page email in about 0.6 font, they say, by the way, this isn't a federal site. So I recommend just go ahead and if you want to check on it, just manually type in sam.gov on your browser and enter directly that way to check on your site for registration. And you only have to do that once a year. And you just basically have to click through everything to say that nothing's changed. It takes about 15 minutes to do the update, typically.
All right, so let's talk about tracking your budget, and then we'll get into the paperwork. So you want to use any of the templates or paperwork that VIA has provided to you. Those are the official forms that you'll need to submit. There's one piece that you will need to create on your own, which is this narrative, but I'll show you that. That's pretty simple. And then keep in mind that your total expenses are tracked by category, not by specific activity. So you may have listed out 3 or 4 activities that you're doing with your grant, but it's that table that we showed at the very beginning that summarizes all of your expenses by those categories. So personnel, supplies, equipment, travel, all of those. those are the categories that are being tracked. And those are tracked across for the total across those 3 years. So it's not typically broken down by those years, even if that's how you may have laid it out initially. And also keep track of your receipts and your invoices as you're spending money, things that you think might be reimbursed under your grant. Best practice is, if you're filling up the gas tank of your delivery truck, getting that receipt, marking down on there what it's for, taking a picture of it, or getting your drivers to take a picture of it with their phone. That way, if you lose that receipt, you're not out that money, because you do have to be able to provide proof that you've spent the funds. So make sure you're keeping track of that, keep it in a folder, scan it into your computer, however works best for you to keep track of all of those. And then make sure you're clear as possible to relate those expenses back to the categories that you're spending the funds in. So like I said, if you get that receipt, just write the category on it, supplies or whatever it might be. You can even just circle the amounts that are on there, anything that makes it as clear as possible, because basically the better your paperwork, the faster you're going to be reimbursed, or the easier it's going to be on V's side. So there won't be as much back and forth with her having to ask questions, get clarification, you redoing any documents, something like that. So just makes it easier for everybody. All right, so these are the specific forms and information that you'll need to provide when doing your reimbursement. The first one is the SF-270. That is the actual request for a reimbursement form where you will list out all of your expenses. And I will pull these up in a minute and we will go through them directly. But along with your SF-270, you will also submit a reimbursement request letter. That's really just a short narrative that relates those expenses that you've listed on your 270 back to what you actually spent the funds on. It allows you to give a little bit more detail and explain to me what those expenses are for. And then along with that, you will have your attachments, which are all of those receipts and invoices that I just told you to keep track of. And all of those should relate. So your 270 should match up to your narrative that you have, which should match up to your receipts and invoices that you have attached. And again, right on those receipts, this is payroll A, and then in your letter, it should say payroll A is attached, make it as clear as possible. And then finally,
I was gonna say that reimbursement letter, remember that's short. You don't have to, you're not writing a novel there. It's just explaining what it is so it makes sense. Where this is labor, farm labor for harvesting. I mean, it can be, a sentence long.
I'll show an example of that in just a second. But then you'll also have the bank book, which is a fillable Excel form. And that's where you can keep track of all of the expenses in each category. That tells you how much you've been spending down over the grant period and how much you're going to have left at the end. So let me see if I can pull up one of the forms for you guys. I'm actually going to start with the letter because while I mentioned the 270 first, I think the letter is a little bit easier to then go back and fill in the 270. So let's see.
It's up, Jessica.
Okay, you guys got the Word document up? You can see the Word document?
Yes, we can. It's good.
All right. So this is going to be the narrative that we just mentioned. As you can see, it's a pretty short letter style that it just communicates directly with V about your expenses. So you'll see this first part just mentions the total that you're requesting in reimbursement. This is the amount that you want to get back from the USDA. And then you have your expenses broken out by category here. So in this example, we have personnel. So we're saying that you would like to be reimbursed for the personnel who was working on your project. So total cost of $1,000 that was accrued during the month time period in October. You're going to indicate who those employees are. So general processing labor and your packing shed labor. Again, this should relate back to your work plan and budget. So under your work plan and budget, you should have mentioned, hey, we've got these employees, X, Y, and Z, who's going to be doing these different activities. So you've listed them there, and then you've attached a copy of your payroll expenses, which are labeled as payroll A. So then in your attachments, again, you should have something that says payroll A on it. So V can clearly look at this and look at your payroll and match it up. So then you're requesting a reimbursement for the $1,000 that you spent on payroll. And in this example, I'm using in-kind match as match towards that because This is also an example of the 1-for-1 match. I have another letter I can pull up that shows the 10% match that some of you may have instead. But this is if you're doing 1-for-1. So you would also say that you're providing in-kind match of $1,000, and that's coming from owner time. So John and Jane Doe have provided 50 hours of their time at a $20 per hour rate. And these are some of the things that they did. They oversaw labor, they helped pack the produce, etc. In your initial application, if you indicated that you were going to be using in-kind time as your match, you should have provided some sort of hourly justification in there to account for how much you're putting in. So just use that justification that you had in your application originally, and that is what that's how you'll track your time if you're the owner or if it's for family labor or anything like that. It's also good to maybe just have an Excel spreadsheet or somehow some sort of document to help you internally track your hours. So as the owner, if you're running produce to the farmer's market or you're spending the day at the farmer's market, just putting a line item on there that says 8 hours at the farmer's market, whatever it is, that just helps you internally track that. So then we have supplies, which is also similar. You're saying that you incurred a cost of $1,000 in supplies. You're going to indicate what that was for, so boxes, labels, etc. And then you want to relate that back to your receipts for that. So you're going to say wholesale packing company spent $510. So you should have a receipt from wholesale packing company for that amount. And then print and marketing materials, similarly, you should have a receipt or an invoice from Vistaprint, and that should be included on there as well. So for the match on this item, this is an example of using your inventory match. So still in kind, but using your inventory, which would be your commodity. So they're requesting reimbursement for $1,000, and then they're providing $1,000 from their inventory. And then you describe how you came up with that. So you provided 500 pounds of vegetables at a commodity value of $2 per pound, and that's the value of your in-kind match. Again, in your application, if you indicated that you were doing inventory as match, you would have provided some sort of justification for the value of that commodity. So just use that. And again, you can track it just like you do your personnel time, where you're, you have an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is that you need to show kind of how you are keeping track of all of that. And then the final category that I have in this example is contractual, and this is using a cash match. So you spent $1,200 on contractual marketing expenses. You paid website development company, and so you'll have an invoice from website development company for that amount that you'll attach to it. But this one's a little bit different because if you're providing your cash as match, you're only going to request half of that. So you spent $1,200, you request $600 back, and then the other $600 is your cash match. So that's how that will break down there. So in this letter, you've laid all of that out very clearly, how much you've spent, how much you're asking to be reimbursed for, the source of your match, and then indicating clearly how that relates back to your attachments.
And then Jessica, there was a request if you could show the 10% match letter.
Yep, I plan on doing that now.
Perfect.
Once I can find it.
And also when you're working on that, obviously, if you didn't include inventory on your budget, you can't now suddenly start claiming inventory. So it has to be what you put back in that you were claiming on your budget as match originally.
All right, is that still sharing? Does that show the?
It's still sharing the 50-50.
How about now?
You just changed. You're perfect.
So this is an example of the same letter, but with 10% match. So similar format, except you will notice now instead of providing an in-kind match of $1,000, you're now providing an in-kind match of $100. Because keep in mind, the 10% match is 10% of the grant amount. So $100 of the $1,000 that you are requesting, same information, same justification that you're providing, all of that. Similar for the supplies, $100 from your produce inventory, Again, still showing the justification for all of that, how you came up with those numbers. The one that's a little bit different is going to be your cash match, because you can't just split it now. So the easiest way, kind of the trick that I use, is just for whatever your total is, divide it by 11, and that gives you what your match is. So this one is $109 is what your match would be. And so then the remaining amount is what you're being reimbursed for. Now, if you're looking at this and you say, but I want to be reimbursed for that full $1,200 that I paid that contractor, you can still do that, but you still have to show, if you're using cash match, you still have to show where you spent money on eligible activities, and that's your match. So in that instance, if you're requesting $1,200 and the contractual expenses to be reimbursed, you're showing another $120 that you spent maybe on supplies or whatever else it might be, but you still have to show that 10% match there. So I'll just let you guys look at that. And I can also send out, when we send out the link for the webinar, I can send out these as templates for you guys to use, if that's also helpful. All right, so now I'm going to share the SF-270 form that you guys will need to fill out and to go along with this. Like I said before, they should really support each other. All right, are you guys seeing that?
It's coming in.
Okay, so this is the SF-270. This is the one I feel like people get intimidated with, because when you first look at it, you're like, I don't know what to do with this. But I feel, so that's why I went through the letter first, because now you've already laid out all your expenses, you know what you spent the money on. So now it's just filling in the form. So this is basic information. Who are you? Name of your organization, all of that, your EIN. If there's a different payee, which I believe it should be the same anyways, the month, the time period that this is covering. So if it was for the past month, then that's what you'll put in. But the meat of it is going to be down here, where you're going to list out those expenses. And again, this should match what you've put in your letter, which is supported by all of your attachments. So personnel, you'll remember, this is the 50-50 example. I'll show the 10% example in a second. So you'll remember in our letter, we said that we were asking for $1,000 to be reimbursed in personnel, and then we were providing $1,000 in match towards it. So your total outlay is $2,000. You're not going to track program income on here, and you don't have any advancements, so it just carries all the way down to line E for that $2,000. Then where you split it out is right here, where it says the non-federal share, which is how much you provided as your in-kind, so that's $1,000. The federal share that you're requesting, which is $1,000, and so that carries down to how much you are now requesting. And then you'll notice that these total all the way across, because similarly, these are all filled out that way. Again, with your cash match here, 600 and 600, totals all the way across. So the most important part of this, though, is making sure you sign it. So don't forget to scroll down, because if you send it in and it's not signed, then it's not complete. But it's pretty simple in terms of just breaking it down, especially for the one-for-one match. But you'll see on the is the 10% one. It's the same thing for the 10% one. Instead of 2,000, it's now 1,100. Non-federal share is $100. Federal share is 1,000, and that's what you're requesting. And you'll also notice that those total amounts match the total line on the top of the letter that you did too. And then don't forget to sign it. So I guess any questions in the chat about those initial forms right now? I can't see the chat, so I'm not sure. But I'll open it up at the end too, and you guys can ask anything that you need.
There was a question is, can you use labor match across all the categories?
It depends on how you broke it out in your work plan and budget. But yes, like you can use labor, you know, if you purchase supplies, but then you're also showing your labor of you going and purchasing those supplies, or however it is, you can use it that way. You don't just have to use the labor for that personnel match. That was just the category that I picked to show it.
But on the 50-50 match, you're limited. I guess if you wanted to pull up the 10% match where that it could happen across on the 10% match where that's the entire amount. On the 50-50 match, of course, you're limited to only half of your time being your own labor.
Right. So in your work plan and budget that you did initially, your full match amount, it can't be over half of that. Can't be from your personnel. Only half could have been from your labor match. But again, it depends on however it was broken out in your work plan and budget originally. If you only did a small portion of in-kind match in your original budget, you can't now do more in-kind. You have to stick with the amounts that you set in there originally. Or if you didn't do any in-kind, you can't suddenly now do it. You have to stick with your cash match if you didn't do any in-kind initially.
And Ashley asked about, can you say about federal and non-federal?
Specifically on this form, the non-federal share is your share. So your match amount, what you put in. The federal share, you want them to give you back as part of your reimbursement. So like this in the 10% example, you put in 10% of your match towards the amount that you're requesting. And then the federal share is how much they're going to give you back.
Do you want to pull up that 10% one, Jessica? Well, while she's doing that, let's see, also at the very top, this will be a reimbursement grant on it. And that you're going to be doing a partial. So you'll be checking those boxes at the top of the form as well.
Which 10% one did you want me to pull up?
You had said you had a 270 10% form.
Is that one not showing now?
No, it's not. Oh, yes, it is. I'm sorry. It is now. I'm catching back up. There we go.
Alrighty, so now I'll talk about the bank book. All right, so you should be seeing an Excel form now. Holler at me if you can't. But this is to help you keep track overall of how much you've been spending out of each of your categories. This is particularly important at the end of the grant period if you might want to do a budget modification, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it's also just good overall to see how you're doing, how you're spending your funds, all of that stuff. So across the top here in these white rows, that's where you will list out the specific categories. So going back to that first slide that we showed that listed out your work plan and budget, this had all those categories: personnel, travel, supplies, contractual. This is where you put those totals. So the totals for all 3 years that you said of how much you requested in grant funds, not including your match. So just the federal funds. So put those totals right there for each of those categories. And then as you're requesting your reimbursements, just enter them in. So let's say for that letter and everything that we just turned in, we sent that in on the 2nd. That's request number 1. It was for a total of $2,600. $1,000 was from personnel, $1,000 was from supplies, and $600 was from contractual. That will automatically deduct down from your totals. So you can see how much you have left in each of those categories on that yellow line. And then again, request number 2, you sent that in December. It was for a total of $3,000. You type in what you requested in each of those categories, and it will continue to deduct down. So you're going to fill up this form, because then at the end, let's say you have a month or 2 before your total grant period is done. It'll show you what you still have left that you need to spend. So you can determine, okay, I need to focus more on buying supplies, or maybe someone needs to get a pay raise, because I need to spend down my personnel funds or whatever it might be. Again, this just keeps track of everything. It's for you and for V to see where you're spending the funds and how it's going. This is also going to be important for the next piece that I'll talk about, which is going to be your biannual report, because you'll need to indicate how much you've been spending and how it's been going. So having that right there in front of you is the easiest way for you to do that. All righty. Any questions about the bank book right now? I'm gonna pull back up.
I think you're good. Awesome.
Should we be back on the presentation now?
There was just a question when they get a copy of the grant for that. A copy of the worksheet.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I'll send all that to you guys. Okay.
And Brian had asked a question I don't understand. Is this for us or submitted? I'm not quite sure what you're asking, Brian. You want to elaborate?
Oh, are you asking if you should also submit that to B? I think yes, and V can correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, submit that to B as well, just so that you guys both keep track of it. But from what I understand, she's not going to be doing that for you. That's something for you to do, but then to also submit. Okay, and you guys are seeing the presentation now?
Yes.
All right, so let's talk about the biannual reports. So as I mentioned, the reimbursements are kind of whatever submission plan that you come up with, whatever schedule that you want to have. You aren't required to turn those in every month, but you can. The biannual report is required and it has to be turned in by a certain time. So your first one is going to be due in April, and that will cover the period from October now until March. And then the next one is going to be due in October, and that will cover the rest of the year from April to September. Those have to be turned in on time in those months. So it's not something where you can say, oh, well, I was going to do it, but you have to do it. And you have to do this for each year of the grant. So if you have a 3-year grant that you're doing, you're going to do this 6 times. So the biannual report includes 2 components. It's the performance progress report, which is really a narrative about how your project's been going, what successes have you had, anything that's been a setback so far. And then that is supported by the federal financial report, and that is similar to your bank book. It just shows how much you've spent so far in your funds. So now let me pull that up for you, and I'll show you an example of what one of those looks like. We'll start with the performance report, which should be up now. So similar to the other one, you just fill in your information, your organizational information, your DUNS, your EIN, the period that this covers, which if this is your first one, again, this is covering October to March, and then it's a semi-annual report. So you just select that. The important part of this is going to be your performance narrative. This is just your opportunity to communicate with V and the USDA about what's been going on in your project. Have you met the goals that you've set so far in your when you originally did your application? That could be things like, did you add more customers like you said you were? Did you get that new wholesale account that you mentioned? Did you hire new employees? Did something happen that caused a setback? You know, was there really bad weather and you lost your crops, and so you weren't able to make as good a sales? Did, you know, a pandemic happen and all of your markets closed down, and you weren't able to make the sales that you thought? So just communicating anything that has happened, what you're doing so far. Did you completely go gangbusters and now you're this huge success? It's great. You know, that's what they want to hear. But it doesn't just have to be on the successes, it can be on the setbacks too. And then again, don't forget to sign it, because that's the most important part. It's not complete unless you sign it. Also keep in mind, you can type directly into this form, or you can do it in a separate document and attach it. It doesn't have to be. And there's no set format, you know, like that letter I showed you guys. There's no set format that you have to follow with this, as long as you have all of your information in there. And then obviously you have this form with it as well, if it's a separate attachment. And again, it doesn't have to be pages and pages long, just enough to be able to communicate your story.
But most important is making sure you're turning it in on time.
Yes, turn it in on time.
And that's one of those things to make sure you're compliant in your grant. So if you're not turning in these reports, you become non-compliant on your grant. So the most important thing is to fill the form out and turn it in. And even if you have a question about a detail, go ahead and turn it in and ask that question along with that. The next one, the first one we do by the end of April.
Jessica, I would like to add that on this form, they ask for the recipient account number, and this number is on your grant agreement. It usually starts 46 and then the number of the county. So this is what you put on SF-270 under, I believe, number 4, here under number 5, and also on the performance progress report, there is also the same question. So again, the identifying number, it is on the grant agreement.
Okay, thank you. So this is the federal financial report, which will go along with your performance progress report. Again, fill out all your information, and like we mentioned, use the number that is on your grant agreement there. Again, you'll indicate for the time period that it's for and everything like that. And then this is where you're going to put your total amounts of what you've spent so far over that 6-month period. And again, if you're keeping up with your bank book, that should be pretty easy. Just go in there and copy it over. But this isn't broken out by any of the categories. It's going to be total what you've spent. So the total amount of the federal funds that have been authorized, that's how much you had to begin with. Total amount of expenditure, that's how much has been provided so far, how much has been spent. And then the total federal share is how much the federal funds that have been spent, not your match, but grant funds that have been spent. And then the unobligated balance of federal funds is how much you have left to spend down. And then the recipient share is the total amount of the match that you're required to provide. And then how much of that, the recipient share expenditures, how much of that you've spent so far, how much match that you've provided, which again, it should be in tandem with how much you're spending down, even if it's the 10% or the 1-for-1, because you have to provide that match for every reimbursement. And then how much you have left that you need to spend down. And then I believe that you don't have to report federal income on this form. And then again, it's just signing the boxes. Does that seem to cover that Form V?
Yes.
So again, this one should be pretty easy if you've been tracking it as you go.
And they can always use the bank book, because in the bank book, they will see the balances.
Yeah.
The left balance as of September 30th, for example.
Right.
Is it worth pulling up that bank book again, Jessica, to show kind of where they grab that from?
That should be the bank book. You have your total funds columns here, and your total funds here, so you can see how much you've been spending down. Okay.
And Jessica, I would like to add, I believe somebody had a question. I will create this bank book sheet for everyone, and I will email to everyone, but then they will have to maintain themselves and send it to me. And of course, I will monitor or help them, but I will go over each budget and include amounts in each categories. So, and then after that, I will send this original copy to you for your updates.
Okay. So everybody look out for that from V directly with your specific information. Alrighty, so that basically covers the biannual reports. Don't forget to turn those in. Then finally, budget modifications. So we've mentioned this a couple times, but sometimes, you know, you get to the end of your grant period or almost to the end of it, and you realize that you haven't spent as much money in a category that you originally thought you were. You do have the option to do a budget modification. This is only allowed once. So we suggest that you save it until the end and until you need it, until you're absolutely sure that you can't spend the rest of the money in one of those categories. And it can only be for up to 10% of the budget anyways. So you can't make big sweeping changes across your budget. So that's usually why it's better to wait until the end too.
So Jessica, if I may, it is 10% of the total budget amount. So if the grant is for $250,000 their matching should be 250. Therefore, 10% would be 50,000.
Okay.
But if the matching was only 10%, so again, you will have to 250 plus 25 and 10% of that.
Okay. Yeah, so something to keep in mind and to monitor in your bank book too while you guys are working on that. Also, you can only keep your modifications within the parameters of your original budget. So if for whatever reason you didn't have any funds under the personnel category to begin with, you can't suddenly add funds to it. But if you had personnel and you just didn't spend all of your supplies money, you could move it to that category if it was there originally. And it still has to be for eligible expenses and all of that. And then you do have to provide a rationale for the reason behind your modification. And again, that's kind of where that progress report can come in too. Hey, look, we have this crop loss. I couldn't buy stuff, or whatever it might be. What's the reason? Why do you need the modification? And again, it's recommended to wait until the end of the project or near the end of it to make that move, because you only get one. All right, and so then we'll just open it up for any more questions. Here's our contact information as well. If you guys have specific questions about your budget that you need to kind of get into the actual details of it, maybe have a separate call so we can talk about that. We can go over that, but we can go over some general questions now.
You want to do chat box or verbal?
Either one, whichever works best for you guys.
If you don't mind, I have a quick question if everybody's okay. Workforce employment budget. We hire veterans, young veterans who do not want to be on W-2, but more so 1099.
Subcontractors.
How do you like that to be recorded and reported as both expense and in kind?
Well, you should probably keep some log with how much you're paying them. And I do have some clients that they pay their workers every 2 weeks by check. So you will give me the copy of the check and then the bank statement that the check cleared. And that's it. Yeah.
Wonderful, very helpful, thank you.
And Ashley was asking, will we have a breakdown of the financial log for the report? I said, we don't have that now, but I think once it gets time for reporting time, you will have done some of these reimbursements and it'll probably be a little bit more obvious on that one. What goes in those categories, you should be a little bit more familiar with that by April when that happened, but yeah. But if that's not, we can send out an example, but it's hard for that because that's going to be different from every person on that one. On it. And Brian was asking a little bit of a travel log. I think a travel log can be as simple as a notebook paper that says, your name, what you're doing, what the date is and what that activity is.
Yeah, it's kind of honorary system. I'm not going there and, tracking every movement and follow what you do. Is basically it's up to you to report. Like if you went to the farmer's market twice and you lost your gasoline receipt, you can just keep the track how many miles. And GSA is 56 cents per mile. So I can always reimburse you even if you don't have a receipt. But it's up to you to report this to me and create very simple log. The name, how many miles, the date, where did you go? Something very simple.
Thank you, V.
And like I said, we recommend taking a picture of your expenses when you have them because those little gas receipts and pieces of paper and payment for booth stalls disappear very quickly. So just snap a picture of your cell phone as soon as you got them, and it makes it a lot easier to go back and find them when you're trying
or just even don't keep them and create the log, and I can always reimburse for by the utilizing the GSA rate per mile. So
Thank you. I had one other question. I don't know if I was able to elaborate when I asked about the labor in kind. So I'd like to just kind of describe my question. I think it might be shared across some of the group, but some of us had only one category of an in-kind match. Myself is my labor, and I know there are others that just included inventory as their match because it's such a low percentage. So we only needed to do a little bit. So my question is, you know, I've got 3 or 4 categories, right? Contracting, personnel, and supplies, say. When I go to write that letter or request reimbursement, can I use, if my in-kind is listed in my work plan just under the personnel section as my labor, can I still use my labor as in-kind for my contracting or for my supplies?
And your in-kind labor was the only matching that you used because you had 10% matching?
Yes.
Okay, so this is what I suggest. If you're requesting, for example, 3,000, at the end of your letter, you will say, my matching is 300, which represent 10%, and then you say, I work so many hours.
Okay, then
And
that
that's it.
lends,
So rather than say for each category, since this was the only, you know, category in your matching, your labor, so this will be fine.
okay. Then the other question is, obviously I'm gonna work more than what's required in my match. So say I work 20 hours a week, but I only need 10 hours worth of match. I will just report to you those 10 hours worth of match, correct?
Yes, yes, this is what is required. If you wanted to say, hey, I work 20 hours, however, for the reporting, I'm only claiming 10 hours, that's fine, but this is more writing. Just report what is required, that would be fine.
Thank you. And then the last question is a tax person. I caught that in the very beginning. Jessica mentioned that you could include an accountant fees in there, likely under contractual. I just want to clarify that. Can you get reimbursed for paying a tax person?
You mean if you do taxes for your farm?
Yeah.
I have to double check on that. I will have to get back with you. Just send me an email, and I have to go back and review regulations. I'm sorry, I don't remember.
It just popped up there when she mentioned that before. So, alrighty, thank you.
I think, I'm not sure if you're talking about the slide where we had like unallowable and allowable expenses, where it's talking about payroll and we mentioned taxes there. I think that's specifically for payroll taxes, like the taxes that you're paying on payroll.
Oh, I see. Okay. I was thinking of like a CPA expense for the business.
I think if you had that in your budget under contractual and it was approved, then yes. But again, V may need to check on that.
I don't think it's eligible because it's almost like you asking the government to pay taxes, So it's almost like I have to, but I'm going to double check with DC on that because I don't think it's eligible, but again, I will let you know.
Thank you for all the answers. Appreciate it.
And the other thing I want to be sure to say is, remember, you can't start accruing expenses until the day that you signed your grant agreement. So you can't go back into the past. You have to start from, you know, whenever you signed within the past month or so your grant agreement. So that's when your expenses start. That's when your calendar starts for expenses.
On that though, I do have a question there. I know I'm showing up as Ross. I am not Ross. If we have payroll expenses and we started in October, when the first payroll was paid, but the hours for that were worked in the end of September, could we use those, or the hours would have had to been worked in October to apply?
They should be after the time you signed your grant.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah,
Well, what I do, I believe I put on the grant agreement the start date. And I think for most of you, it was October 1st. So all the very few clients had September 30th. So September 30th, October 1st, all the expenses, you know, starting from this date should be reimbursable. I also would like to mention that if you don't have to wait like 3 years to spend all the grant funds, I have some clients that they apply for 3 years and then they utilize all the grant funds within 1 year. That's okay, that's fine. It's just you cannot go more than 3 years.
And I think in the chat box, Ashley, you had mentioned a couple times, just going back through some of those forms, you're more than welcome to give me a call after the webinar if there's any of the specific forms that you'd like me to go back through again, or we'll send out a link to the webinar too. I know I kind of zoomed through some of those, so I'm happy to answer any specific questions that you might have.
Jessica, I also would like to add that I will be on leave beginning November 22nd, and I will be back in the office, I believe, December 5th. So I really would like to ask you if you have any reimbursement requests, please send them to me maybe like by November 10th. So I have plenty of time to process, and even if it's small, that's okay. But no later than November 10. If not, if you don't have time, then it will have to be in December when I come back.
What were those dates again? You said November 22nd.
November 22nd, and I'll be back December 5th, December 5.
And like a lot of bank accounts, the first reimbursement usually takes a little bit longer to get money back through the system, just because of the internal connections, you know, with USD, et cetera, even though the money's already obligated. It usually takes just a little bit longer for the first ones than some of the other reimbursements on the federal side.
And the funds are, this is direct deposit. So the funds will be deposited to your accounts. And from the time when I process, it usually takes 3 days. But then if it's, you know, during the weekend, that will take up to 5 days. If the bank accounts are correct, I really don't have any problem with those transactions. Couple times I got the wrong bank account. So in this case, what the government will do, they will mail check to my office in Walterboro, and then I have to go there and then mail the check to you. So it takes longer. So it's very important that those account numbers are correct.
And that is again why we
Changing
recommend
that.
a small one for the first one to double check and make sure it's all right.
What if you end up switching banks during this experience?
Yes, well, then I will have to, you have to let me know. You have to provide me a new ACH banking form signed by your bank with the new account numbers, and then I will have to re-enter those new bank accounts. And what will happen, those bank accounts, it takes up from 5 to 10 business days to be verified by the national office. So there'll be a little bit more waiting, but it has been done in the past. It's no problem, but it just takes a little bit longer.
Sounds like I'll avoid that. Okay, thanks.
Cool. Any other questions?
And again, you guys have our contact information, so you can email or call if you think of anything later.
So Steve, I think we're turning it back over to you then.
All right. Well, I'm just going to stop recording and then thanks for advice and good luck on the paperwork. I'm sure after you do it once or twice, you'll be pros. So
Sounds good.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.